All right, so today is all going to be about measuring psychological variables. The first two slides should be review from last class and the pre-lecture, but like we've talked about before, psychology is really interested in studying mental life or processes that are going on in your head, right? We can't, as researchers, read what's going on. What are you thinking about, how you're feeling? So obviously, we have to ask you. This mental life or these processes that are going on must be inferred from reports, behaviors, and reactions. So today we're going to focus on self-report options. We're going to focus on self-report. However, hopefully you had a chance to look at that pre-lecture. Again, please look at these pre-lectures before class. If you don't, they're typically only 5 minutes and they provide a lot of background information for the actual lecture. But like usual, in the chat, using that like send a direct message to me feature, type in what you think the answer is to this. So Dr. Prest is interested in the effects of alcohol consumption on symptoms of depression. To measure depression, she assesses the total amount of time spent crying during a 1-hour therapy session. So what type of measure is she using? Is she using a self-report measure, a behavioral measure, a physiological measure, or a qualitative measure? So go ahead and do that direct message. What type of measure is she using? All right, I'm seeing a bunch of B's, a C's, a couple A's. All right, so she's using a behavioral measure. She is observing, right? We're observing the amount of time someone has spent crying. I could see potentially answering C, this physiological. However, physiological is more looking at like sweat and heart rate and things that are going on inside the body. Crying really isn't a physiological measure. However, if this was like an open-ended question on a test, and I would have you explain your answer, and you try to explain physiological, I could see it, but it's definitely for sure behavioral. It's not self-report. So we're going to go in today what self-report is, but self-report would be asking the participant, or I would say it's a participant, how often do you find yourself crying? So self-report is actually the participant reporting on questions that we give them. Behavioral, we are observing actions, right? We are observing this participant's behavior. Yeah, all right, good job. I was like, I don't think anyone has said D, but anyways, all right. So it's definitely not self-report, but definitely behavioral. All right, good job. Majority of people got that. All right, so also consider this theory. Increased driver workload decreases driving ability. To test this theory, right, we must create specific hypotheses by creating operational definitions. And so we need to create operational definitions for the independent variable and the dependent variable. Because otherwise, how are we actually going to measure what we're trying to look at? Right? There are many different ways, and I think actually this is a point that's going to come up on the next slide, to measure driver workload. First off, what is driver workload? What is driving ability? There are many things that make up driving ability. So in order to make a hypothesis, we need to be very specific in what we're measuring. So we need to be specific in what, how we measure the IV, or the independent variable, which is, the definition is the variable that is believed to be the cause of some change. And then we also need to define how we're measuring the dependent variable, or the variable that's believed to be the effect. The dependent variable depends on, values of the independent variable. Now, timeout. Once again, please make sure you've read that really long email from me in regards to, while yes, for purposes of the test, This is the definition of independent variable and dependent variable. But whenever we go on later in the semester on interpreting the results of the correlation, we need to take into consideration that correlation does not imply causation, and we can't say the IV causes changes in the DV in regards to our interpretation of correlations. But for the purposes of tests, please know that these are the two definitions of, or the definition of the IV and DV. So we need to create definitions for our variables. So once again, how might we measure driver workload? There's multiple different ways. Driver workload could be, the amount of time someone spends not looking at the road. So, looking at texting, changing dials on the air or the music and volume. Maybe there's kids in the car. How distracted is the driver due to kids in the car? There's multiple different ways to measure driver workload, and we need to be very specific in how we define it. Same way with driving ability. How are we measuring driving ability? Or the amount of times that they go outside of the lines on the road. Maybe we're having them do a driving test where we're looking for specific things. Maybe we're using how the DMV uses to determine their driving. I'm not 100% sure how they do it, but they have a set of rules or criteria that they're looking for. So we need to create these very specific operational definitions for how we're measuring things in order to have testable hypotheses. Because if any of these hypotheses that we come up with are contradicted, our data says, hey, your hypothesis isn't correct, maybe we need to go back and look at the actual theory itself, right? Maybe the theory is wrong, using that logic that we applied, I think like 2 classes ago. Remember, if the observations are wrong, maybe the theory is wrong. But also, we may be able to look at the operational definitions of the constructs. Maybe we didn't measure it accurately. And so having very specific definitions of these constructs allows us to maybe tweak them a little bit. So we really are going to focus on measurement. So hypothetical constructs cannot be measured directly, right? This is going back to that point of how do you measure happiness, or how do you measure intelligence, or something like social media use. There's so many different things that make up these constructs that we're interested in. So they can't be measured, most of these can't be measured directly. However, all constructs have these external factors or observable behaviors or events that are believed to reflect the construct. Hopefully this definition isn't new, but operational definitions are the means by which we measure a construct based on all these external factors. So what makes up a good operational definition is it has to be observable. And now, when I say observable, I don't mean you have to actually be able to physically see something with your eyes, right? If I ask you, and we'll see a little bit later on, what makes up like the construct of anger, it may not necessarily be things that we as researchers can see, right? How angry someone is feeling, we can't see it, but we can measure it by asking them. So observable doesn't mean things that we as researchers can physically see. It just means that it can be directly measured. And we're going to talk today and over the next day, over on Friday, how to actually measure these things. And a good operational definition is also replicable. So how I measure, what we were just talking about, how I measure driving ability should be able to be measured by other researchers and multiple times. So it should be able to be consistently measured by anyone using the same technique that I came up with. So let's stop and think about how we can measure some of these things. And I've had you kind of do this in other classes, but how might we operationalize, if we wanted to study intelligence, how might we be able to do it? Just unmute yourself and call out one idea for how you can measure intelligence. Remember, there's not one right answer for this.
Can you do it by like your IQ?
Right, we can measure someone's IQ. And that is something that's concrete, right? We can take the, what is it called? Like the Wechsler's intelligence test or something like that. We can do something concrete. How else might we be able to measure intelligence?
Study habits?
In what way? Expand a little bit more on that.
How long they're studying, how in depth they are with their studying.
Sure, that might go more into motivation, which may be related to intelligence, but you can maybe be able to work in your definition of intelligence to include something like that. Because, but then again, potentially really smart people might not need to study, right? So that might not be the best definition for intelligence. How about something like? Does anyone else have any ideas?
Could you go based on GPA?
Sure, GPA. GPA is a measure of intelligence. Now, once again, you could use it if you were measuring intelligence, but GPA might also represent or be influenced by several other things. Perhaps how hard your classes are, right? Someone who's really smart but taking really hard classes may have a lower GPA than someone who's not as intelligent but taking really easy classes. So that could be, but yes, you're correct. GPA could be potentially scores on the first exam, right? In theory, people who are more intelligent should, in theory, score higher exam scores. So we could use exam scores. How about exercise? How could we measure exercise?
Like how long you exercise.
Sure, simple. We could ask people or observe how long do you spend exercising? But even then, exercising can be made up of several different things, right? You have cardio, you have muscular ones. Is that what it's called? I don't know. But you have weight training. I think it is. You have weight training. I didn't know this the word for it in the last class, and I still don't know it. You can use weight training. You can do cardio. So there's different. You have to be very specific because if you were reading a study and they just said, "Oh, we measured how much exercise they engaged in," maybe they do mean just general exercise, right? Walking. Um, how much walking, how many cardio. They include everything, or maybe they want to be really specific. It depends on their dependent variable and the theory or their hypothesis that they're saying. How about the use of social media? How can you measure the use of social media? This is a really broad construct, right? That is just it's just a hypothetical construct. Social media use. There's many different ways to measure it. How could you measure it?
Like how often you post something.
Sure. So that's what's called active use of social media. How often you're posting or liking stuff. Someone in chat said heart rate could be a measure of exercise. Yeah, that would be a good physiological measure of exercise because you can measure increased heart rate and consider that to be exercise because that's really what exercise is, right? Unless you're doing that's what cardio exercise is increasing that heart rate and getting it pumping. So that'd be a physiological measure. But yeah, social media use, active use. You could look at passive use of social media. So just how long you spend just scrolling through Instagram. You could do how many apps you use, how many number of different platforms you use, how long you spend on it, how many likes you get. So maybe you could get really specific and say, well, I want to study experiences on social media, and I want to know if people are having positive or negative experiences. And so you can maybe see how many likes people get and if they're satisfied with those amount of likes. Just for the sake of time, something like attractiveness. There's multiple different ways that you can measure attractiveness. You could go really biological and or sociological and study some symmetry. Traditionally, people who have more symmetrical faces are perceived worldwide to be more attractive. You can use waist for females. You can use things like the waist to hip ratio, where there's like a universal standard of like I think it's like 0.8 or something like that of the waist to hip ratio for what the world on average men find to be and females find to be as attractive. Or you can just ask people, on a scale of 1 to 10, how attractive do you find Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie to be? So there's multiple different, the point I'm trying to get across here is there are hundreds, maybe exaggeration, but there are many ways to measure a hypothetical construct. And you really need to have a good operational definition, with a good and a good and specific way of measuring your things in order to have a good study. So In the pre-lecture, Dr. Tenenholz talked about several different ways that we can measure things. But today we're going to focus solely on self-report measures. And then I believe tomorrow we're going to get into things, into some of the other ones. Taking a pause, I do want you to know that for your correlational project, you will have to come up with self-report measures. Or you're going to have to come up with a self-report measure of whatever variable you are investigating. So exercise, body image, or social media. And one of the things that I want you to think about while I'm going over this lecture is applying it to your own variable. How are you going to assess your own variable? And I'm going to give you some pointers, and you're going to have some guidelines of things that you have to do, but this lecture today is really going to focus on that. So self-report measures rely on the participants' self-assessments of their behaviors and experiences. If, as researchers, we want to know something, what's the best way to do it? Well, let's just ask the participant. Or maybe not the best way, but what's the most convenient way to do it? We can just ask the participant. And this is typically done through questionnaires or surveys. Think back to that self-esteem, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale I had you fill out last class or last week. You know, how would I, as a researcher, measure someone's self-esteem? Can I really do it by looking at them, you know, looking at their behaviors? Maybe, but it would be really hard. What would be a better way? You know, just asking them questions related to self-esteem. So if we want to know, we can ask, and we can do that via self-report measures. So the next couple of slides are going to go into different types of self-report measures. And the first one we're going to focus on is this open-ended. So open-ended is what it sounds. Probably all of you have had some form of open-ended question on an exam or a test, but it's an essay type question with no fixed answer. We just ask a question to the participant, and we just allow them to answer however they want. This can be very informative. So it can be very useful because it allows the participant not to be guided by anything, right? We don't limit their thinking, and we just ask them, well, tell us what you think. But from a data analysis standpoint, it can be really difficult to interpret because I'm not going to go into it too much, but you have to start applying coding to the participants' answers and start seeing trends across all the participants. It's just really hard to score. And it's not as easy as, let's say, a 1 through 10 scale where it just applies at a number. So here's an example of an open-ended question. People are delaying marriage longer today than ever before. What's the best thing about waiting until you are 30 plus to get married? So we would, you know, if we were doing a survey or a study about marriage or whatever, we could just ask the participant to, hey, we give them a text box, or we just verbally ask them, and we have them say, you know, what's the best thing about waiting till you're 30 plus to get married? And the participant can talk for maybe 5 seconds or maybe 10 minutes. Maybe they have a whole spiel about why it's the best to wait until after 30 plus. So that's an example of an open-ended question. Pretty straightforward, right? Just allow the participant to respond however they want. Now we're going to go into close-ended types of questions. And the first one we're going to focus on is fixed alternative. So fixed alternative are true or false, or these multiple choice questions, where we limit the responses that participants can answer. It's typically less informative, but it is easier to summarize the data and start seeing patterns. So here are some examples of these fixed alternative questions. We have things like, you know, what is your gender? Male, female, other, where participants have to choose between 2 or 3 or 4 options. Or we can have multiple choice questions, right? The best reason to wait until 30 plus to get married is, and we give them some options: more time to establish a career, find the right person, a better sense of who you are as a person, or other. So participants can choose from some options. And then typically in questions like this, where we have an other, we allow them to give, like we have an open-ended response and allow them to put the answer in. But these are fixed alternative. Just think of them as multiple choice questions. The next type of questions that we're going to focus on are these rating scale responses. And so I do want to say that for your study, these are the type of questions that you're going to be asking your participants. In rating scale responses, participants are going to report on the frequency or intensity of their behaviors, thoughts, or opinions. It's more informative than simple fixed alternative, and it's easy to summarize the data. So we're going to go into, I believe, 2 or 3 different types of rating scale responses. And the first one is this standard scale, or maybe, and this is probably one that you're more familiar with. So on a standard scale, you just ask the participant, like on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, how likely are you to wait until the age of 30 plus to get married? And then, it's from like not at all likely to extremely likely. Or and it doesn't have to be not at all likely or extremely likely. It just depends on what type of question you're asking. If I ask you, how attractive do you find Brad Pitt to be, from not at all attractive to very attractive on a scale of 1 to 100, that is a standard scale. Typically, they're from 1 to 10 or from 1 to 100, but in theory, you could have it go from 1 to 50 or 1 to 25. It doesn't matter. Probably easier to go from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 from the participant standpoint, right? It's easier to answer when those base 10, 1 to 10, 1 to 100. But yeah, this is a standard scale. Scale of 1 to 100, 1 to 10. What do you think about whatever question that we're asking? Next up is the Likert scale. And this is probably, or actually this is what I'm going to recommend / really guide people towards using for the questions in their own, in their study. So a Likert scale is really based on the reports of the extent to which people agree or disagree with whatever question you're asking them. So if I put out this question, I plan to wait until I'm at least 30 years old to get married for the first time. Let's say, we're sticking with this marriage idea or study, and we want to know, what age are participants getting married at or want to get married at? So we ask the question, I plan to wait until at least 30 to get married. And then we ask on a 1 to 5 scale, or it doesn't have to be 5. It can be, typically Likert scales range anywhere from 4 to 7. But the really key part of a Likert scale is that if you notice, we goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree. But you're like, okay, this is very similar to the standard scale, right? I'm going to go back a slide. And we can see a standard scale goes from not at all likely to extremely likely. And this one goes from like strongly disagree to agree. They're very similar. However, with Likert scales, you can see each response option, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, has a word associated with it, right? Where like a 2 is disagree and a 4 is agree. And we have this middle option here, neither agree nor disagree, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we can see with the Likert scale, right? We're assessing how much a participant agrees or disagrees with whatever question that we throw out at them. One thing I want you to notice here is that with a Likert scale, they typically, like I said, range from 4 to 7. I believe the self-esteem scale I had you do was 4. But here I want to show you 2 examples of a 5 response option scale and a 6. I'm going to switch back and forth between them because they're slightly different, right? They both go from strongly disagree to strongly agree. However, we notice closer in the middle that in the 5 response option, we have this neither agree nor disagree. We have a direct middle. However, with this 6 response option, we don't have a direct middle, right? We don't have like I neither agree nor disagree. It breaks it up into slightly disagree and slightly agree. I'm gonna throw a question out. I think it's within 2 slides or a slide that gets at maybe why one is better than the other. But just know that they can range from 4 options to 5 options to 6 options. Or 7 options. So yeah, actually, here's this question. So I have the one with 5 at the top and the one at 6 at the bottom. So once again, using that direct message feature, why do you think, well, what is the main advantage of using 6 response categories on a Likert scale rather than 5? Is it because the greater number of points on our response scale, the more information we're collecting? Because there's 6, there's more information. The mean response can be more accurately calculated with an even number of categories. People prefer being given more choices and therefore are more likely to respond. Or D, respondents must decide between agreeing and disagreeing. All right, I'll wait another 10 seconds for people to put their answer in. All right, so I'm seeing some mixed responses here. So the correct answer is D. In psychological research, when we're having participants look at or answer these questions, people love to sit on the fence. They love to say, well, I neither agree nor disagree. And this really isn't helpful in terms of figuring out, like, we want people to vary in their answers. And we're going to get into that in a couple weeks when we start talking, actually, I think next week when we start talking about like variability. But in order to find significant results and things, we need people to vary in their answers. And if we give people this neither agree nor disagree option, people are going to love to sit on that fence and sit in the middle of the road. If you look down here at the 6th response option, people have to choose between slightly disagree and slightly agree. It makes them think more about the question and how they truly feel. I saw a couple Bs. It doesn't matter. Finding the average, it doesn't matter how many numbers there are. Finding the average is the same amount of accuracy, whether there's 5 or 6 or 500 options. I saw a couple A's. You're not really gaining any more information by having some more options. It would be, now, if we were talking about those fixed response options where it's like the multiple choice or the fixed alternative, however I said it, however it's worded, that the answer A may be better, because if you have more options, people can choose more options. But when we're talking about the standard scale or the Likert scale, excuse me, having that middle of the road option, people are going to be more likely to choose it, and we don't want that. We want them to have to decide between agreeing or disagreeing. So going back to this, I said it's on a scale of like agreeing to disagreeing, or disagree to agree. You don't have to just use strongly agree and disagree. Here are some other options that you can use. So think about, how you're going to measure your own variable. And it really all depends on how you ask your question. Because you can ask a question in multiple different ways, and use different types of responses, but still get at the same thing. So I'm going to think about something like body image. So let me come up with an example of body image where I'm going to ask the question in 2 different ways, using 2 different types of questions, but still get at the same thing. So one way we can ask about body image is, are you satisfied with your body, right? And so we could use this satisfaction one where we do it on a scale of 1 to 5. And now I know I said it's probably better to use 6 instead of 5, but using 5 is perfectly fine. And actually, I think most research uses 5 or 7, but more recently, research is trying to push towards using 6 options to get rid of that middle of the road option for participants to choose. Anyways, so let's go back to that body image question. How satisfied are you with how you look? You could use this not at all satisfied to completely satisfied. Now I could ask the question in a different way. I could say, I am satisfied with my body. And then we could have people use the disagree to agree, right? So it's still assessing the same thing. I just asked the question in a slightly different way and can use a slightly different scale. How would you rate the quality of your body? Probably a little bit weird to ask it in that way, but you could use very poor to excellent. We're going to talk about in a little bit multi-item scales because you want to ask multiple questions to assess one construct. But maybe you ask about how often do you feel bad about your body? And you could use never to always, right? So depending on how you phrase your question, you can use different response options. And it just all depends how you phrase your question. So don't think, going back, that you have to use strongly disagree to strongly agree. It all just depends how you phrase your questions. So I believe we have one more of the rating scale response, but it's this bipolar scale. So this is where participants will report where their behaviors, thoughts, opinions fall between two opposite points. So I see this a lot of time with like emotions, where we can ask people, how are you currently feeling right now? And it can be, happy on one end to sad on the other, or, whatever an antonym for happy could be. But typically when these type of scales, there might be some like slider option. So let's say, please rate your marriage or relationship along the following dimensions. And you can imagine on one end would be easy, on the other end would be difficult. And I could do a slider and slide it towards one end or the other. So that's what a bipolar scale is. When you have two antonyms for whatever you're measuring, stable versus unstable, hostile versus harmonious, happy versus sad, those type of questions. And like I said, it's typically on a slider where you can slide between the two. All right. So does anyone have any questions or would like for me to clarify anything on types of questions? Or would anyone like me to go back to any slide because they want to, they missed something and they want to write it down? I should mention every lecture is posted on a YouTube afterwards. So if you ever miss anything, go check out the link on eCampus, and then you can scroll through and go back to whatever section you need to go to.
Does the bipolar scale have to be on a slider, or is it just usually?
No, it doesn't have to be on a slider. You could have, how many options do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we could have like 7 blanks, and maybe I could just have the participant put an X right here, whichever one they're closer to. I think it looks better with a slider. I think it just makes more sense. But no, it doesn't have to be on a slider. I was trying to think of, when I was looking over this lecture, how else bipolar scales are done. And I've never seen it done in any other way. But there are other ways. Like I said, you could just have them put an X in one of these blanks where where you fall. All right.
I was gonna ask, like, for example, I was looking at the different type of responses like that we can like offer like whoever's taking the survey. And like I feel like if I was taking a survey and had to either disagree or disapprove something, my answer was like slightly change, because like maybe saying like I would disapprove something is like a way stronger like response than saying that you disagree with something. Might that change the results as that like how we get the response?
So this is where I see what you're saying. So this is, it matters how you ask your question. So, going back to my body image question, how you ask your question really dictates how you like what scale you use. And so you may have to use something you may have to choose between disapprove and disagree. Where as a researcher, you will have to choose between asking about approval versus asking about agreement. Because let's say I ask the question, how satisfied are you with your body? Right? That's a pretty simple question. I obviously can't put it on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree, right? So I'm forced, if I'm going to ask about satisfaction, and all my questions are going to be about satisfaction, I have to obviously use this satisfaction. Typically, so you'll never, as a participant, be forced to like choose between disagree and disapprove on the same scale. um, I see what you're saying though, because disagreeing with something may be slightly less of a feeling than disapproving. Disapproving may be a really strong feeling, and compared to disagreeing. However, because I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah. Like me as responding to a survey, like I feel like I will feel almost like bad saying that I disapprove something rather than like disagreeing with something. So maybe like if I got a survey that was like about approval, I will maybe like be more like lenient to put like neutral instead of like disapprove. And like if I was in a scale of agreement, I wouldn't really have an issue with putting disagree.
Yeah, so this might be more of a question. This would the type of question that you're asking. There's a type of psychology that focuses on scale and measurement. It's like scale and measurement psychology, and they really focus on when you're developing a scale, right? Let's say you're developing a scale that uses an agreement response. Typically, what you'll do is you'll compare it to other scales. And so you come up with a scale that uses this disagree option, and you'll compare it, you'll ask that your disagree questions. But then you'll also ask a scale that uses another set of questions, and maybe they use disapprove. And what you can do using a bunch of interesting analysis, you can even do a correlation actually. So what if there was a difference in whatever you're assessing, maybe it's do you approve of the president, right? Or you could also ask, do you agree or disagree with the president?
With the president.
So when you're developing a scale, what you would do is you would ask it in different ways, or you can ask it in different ways, and then compare the answers. Because someone who on this scale of agreement who says disagree should also probably say something along the lines of disapprove. And now, if that doesn't happen, let's say you find that people who are more likely, who say disagree, are going to say they strongly disapprove, or maybe they're neutral. Then you might know that, hey, it may matter on what scale we ask people.
Okay.
So that's my answer to you, is when you're developing a scale in the real world, you ask it in multiple different ways, and you correlate them all together, or you compare them all, and you see if there's any major differences. And if there's any major differences, you may have to step back and think, okay, maybe we aren't asking the question in the right way.
Okay, thank you.
That was a great question. All right. So are there any other questions about types of questions that we can ask? All right, they were all great questions. All right, so let's now focus on, well, how many questions should we ask, right? If we want to assess a construct, should we only ask one question? Should we ask 100 questions? What's the right amount of questions? So the answer to that is, it depends on what you're measuring. So let's think about a single item. So a single question may be sufficient to get at what we're trying to assess. Think about questions like, what is your race? Do I need to ask 6 different questions about what is your race to figure out the answer? No. I can just ask one, what is your race, and give people options. Or what is your marital status? Single, separated, married, widowed. I don't need to ask 10 questions to assess your marital status or your age, right? I don't need to ask multiple questions. So single items can be really useful, and actually the only logical thing to use. Typically, single items are reserved for demographic questions. So can someone tell me what demographics are in a study or in research?
Is it age?
Yeah, so demographics are just things that describe your participants. So that's some of the things that you're going to be asking in your own study, right? What is the age of your participants? What is the gender? What is the race? If you were doing a study on marital status, you probably want to ask, what is your marital status? So for some things, single items are good. Oh, here's another one. If you're asking, what is your current mood, right? If I'm asking you, On a scale of 1 to 10, how bored are you right now? One question is perfectly fine for that. Now, don't put it in the chat. Don't, because probably a lot of you are 8, 9s, and 10s for how bored you are taking Psych 203 in the afternoon in the summer. So I don't want to see those answers. But I don't need to ask you 6 questions about how bored you are right now, right? One question is perfectly fine. Yeah, this, like, you're asking demographic questions about the sample. Someone sent me a direct message. Yeah, so one question. So if you're asking about emotions, about current feelings of emotions, probably one question is perfectly fine. Let's move on to multi-item scales. So this is what a majority of research uses in psychological research, is these multi-item scales. So here's one for an emotion. You know, we can measure anger with one item, right? On average, how angry are you on a scale of 1 to 10? But can someone shout out what could be the problem? And someone already sent me a direct message or asked me a question in direct message like 10, 15 minutes ago that kind of hints at this. But what is the problem with only using one question to ask this? On average, how angry are you? Yeah, someone said in chat, not everyone, how do you define anger, right? And how do you think about how angry you are? So think about someone you know who is typically an angry person, where they're just general demeanor, they're just more angry on average than the average person. If I were to ask them, how angry do you think you are, to that angry person, they probably have a different standard of angry than an average non-angry person, right? If I'm always constantly angry, or not constantly, but if I'm typically angry, I'm probably going to say, I'm not that angry, because they have different standards of what extreme anger is. So measuring anger with a multi-item scale is better. Now, if I were to ask you, once again, how bored are you right now, or how angry are you right now, these in the moment, right now assessments, one question is perfectly fine. But if I'm going to ask, on average, how angry are you, it's probably better to use a multi-item scale that gets at different ideas of what anger is. So let's take a look at some of these questions, how you can measure anger. You could, on the scale, you would ask, how likely are you to lose control of your emotions, right? That is a characteristic of an angry person. That was the word I was looking for, characteristic. How likely are you to lose control of your emotions? How often does your anger, interfere? How often does your anger interfere with your sleep? How often are you to have difficulty in thinking clearly because of your anger? And how likely are you to shout at people when you become angry? So if someone who is a really angry person, they would be more likely to score or to rate themselves like 8, 9s, and 10s, right? Because we're asking very clear and concise characteristics of anger. And so someone who's an angry person would score higher on the scale whenever we add them all up or we average them together. And someone who's not an angry person would be scored lower, because we ask these things that are very clear and it's not open to interpretation, because people have different concepts of anger. But we could say, that you can't really interpret how often does your anger interfere with your sleep, right? It's a little bit harder to interpret compared to just on average, how angry are you? So multi-item scales are necessary to measure these complex constructs. So what are the benefits to multi-item scales? Well, they allow for a more thorough, meaningful measurement of these complex concepts, like I just talked about. But there's also a statistical advantage. The summary score, so if you add them all up, right, if you add up all those questions, is on an interval scale. Now, this is something that we're going to focus on later, But so you just need to know for the purposes of a test that the advantage to a multi-item scale is that when you add them all up, it's on an interval scale. And we're going to focus on, I don't know what day it is, on what like nominal, interval, ordinal, and there's one more, I can't, ratio, what that means. But one of the big benefits to an interval scale is that we can find mean and standard deviations of it. And that's what that's actually what I think every statistical analysis ever looks at, mean and standard deviation, and it applies it to, in different ways. But that's one of the advantages to a multi-item scale. All right, so does anyone have any questions about multi-item scales or single item scales? And why one might be better in one scenario compared to another scenario where multi-item might be better compared to, a single item? All right. So here are some things. Before I get into this, I want to pause and kind of recap where we're at in terms of your study. So every group has picked out a topic, and I listed out those topics in the email, but people are looking at exercise and self-esteem, body image and self-esteem, social media and stress, and social media and self-esteem. So all of you have this grand idea, right? You have these constructs: exercise, body image, and social media. The next step, and this is something that not right now, but let me look at the syllabus real fast. Next Friday, we're really going to focus on this. And I probably will send an email out being like, hey, here's some things that you should be thinking about. But one of the things that you should be thinking about is, as you're looking through this research that you're looking for assignment number 1 is, all right, I need to get, or as a group, you need to get more specific in what you're measuring. So what about exercise are you measuring? Is it amount, perceptions of how much they enjoy it? How you need to be specific. Body image, what are you interested in about body image? Social media is really, really broad. Like we talked about, actually we did it for both exercise and social media, but there's multiple different ways or things that we could be measuring. So that's the next step. You need to become a little bit more concise in what you're measuring. And then what we'll also be doing on Friday and really focusing in on next Friday is we need to develop some questions to assess whatever you're measuring. So what I will say is you're going to need to create a multi-item scale. So you're going to come up with 5 to 7 questions to assess your specific construct. But it's up to you to come up with those questions. And let me go back a little bit more. I'm going to push you to use one of these scales. So you use a Likert scale, but choose between one of these depending on how you frame your questions. So this could be kind of difficult because you're going to want to keep all of your questions the same. And here's what I mean by this. So let me go up, where is it? So if you're asking about marriage, right, and your group came up with marriage and whatever, you're going to want to have 5 to 7 questions that are all on this strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. So all of your questions should be asked on just one of these. What you don't want to do is have a question worded where you ask about quality. And then another question, your question number 2 is on a importance response format. And then question number 3 is on satisfaction. What you're going to want to do is come up with questions that are worded in a way where they all can be asked on a 1 to 5, 1 to 6, 1 to 7 scale using just one of these. So we're going to focus a little bit more on next Friday on this, you're going to focus completely, all Friday is going to be dedicated to that. But that's just what I want you to be thinking about. So thinking about defining your construct a little bit more. What specifically about exercise, body image, and social media are you interested in? And then coming up with questions that you can assess that construct. Now, I should mention, it might sound hard, but let's say you have 5 questions that uses strongly disagree, but you have one that really, that is like on a satisfaction. I guarantee you 99% of the time, you can reword that question to fit on any scale that you want. So I will work with you as a group, but just so you know, this is what's in the future. All right, so here are some things that I want you to take into consideration when coming up with questions. I think there's like 5 or 6 things that I want you to think about. First, keep it simple. You need to consider your audience. Use non-technical language at an appropriate reading level. So think about how smart the average person is, right? Just think about your friends, family. Think about the average person. And now remember that 50% of the population is not that smart, is dumber than that, right? So we need to make sure that our questions can be read by everyone. One thing that I would suggest is think about your questions whenever you come up with them and make it so that a middle schooler can understand and answer them. That's about the level that you want your questions to be. Don't use technical jargon, make it simple. You need to be specific as well. So this is getting back into, you really need to define your construct, right? What are you measuring in social media, exercise, or body image? But your questions also need to be specific as well, using specific language. So you need to avoid terms like lately. So let's say you wanted to ask, let's stick on exercise. You want to know how often someone exercises and use the word like, lately, how often have you been exercising? Well, what does lately mean? Lately to me might mean in the past 2 days. Lately to someone who's 75 might mean the last 5 to 10 years, right? So you need to be very specific in how you ask things. So if you want to ask about how often someone is doing something, be specific. Say within the past week. How often have you done this? Or how often have you thought about how your body looks, within the past week? So you need to be very specific in time frames. You need to avoid ambiguity. So let's say you're doing a study about happiness, right? And a bad question to ask is, what do you try to do every day? All right, what does that even mean? If I'm a participant reading that, even though the study might all be about happiness, or it might be about exercise, asking the question, what do you try to do every day, can be interpreted in many different ways. So you want to be a little bit more specific. What do you try to do to maintain your happiness, right? Or you could even word it even better. What are some things that you do throughout the day to increase your happiness or to, become not unhappy? That's a double negative, so definitely don't do that. But yeah, so you want to be specific and avoid wording that could be interpreted in multiple different ways. You also want to avoid the use of negative wording. So don't use a double negative. Definitely don't use a double negative. Those are hard to understand in any situation. But you also want to avoid double-barreled items. So what's a double-barreled item? How useful and how much have you enjoyed your experience at WVU? Well, that's 2 questions. How useful have you found WVU to be, and how much have you enjoyed? So make it into 2 questions. So make sure that your question is only assessing one thing. That's the idea of a double-barreled item, is just a question that assesses 2 different things. All right, number 4, don't make assumptions about your participants. So questions should have appropriate answers for all participants. So if I was doing a social media study, one of my a question that makes an assumption is, how many platforms of social media do you use a day? And the responses range from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 to 10. You're assuming that participants use social media, right? And so there's no zero option for people to say, well, I don't use social media. Or here's a question. I tend to have positive experiences on social media on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. Well, if I don't use social media, how can I answer that option, right? I don't have positive or negative experiences on social media because I don't use them. So you can't make assumptions about your participant, and make it so that every participant can answer your question in one way or the other. Number 5 is definitely one I want you to think about when coming up with your own questions, and that is mix positive and negative worded items. So what do I mean by this? So let's say we're doing a study where we ask someone about their experiences in a class, right? Your experiences in Psych 101. And you want to have positive and negative questions for reasons that I'll talk about after I give you 2 examples. So an example of a positive item, a worded question is, I am happy with my grades. And let's say this is on a scale of disagree to agree, right? Let's just keep it simple. I am happy with my grades. Well, you could also ask a question in a negative way. I feel upset about my performance. So let's think about how someone would respond to this. Let's think about someone who is an A+ student who did really well and they really enjoyed their experience. How would they answer on a scale of disagree, 1 disagree to 5 agree? How would someone who really enjoyed their experience and got really good grades answer question number 1? I am happy with my grades. Would they say disagree or agree? Someone just shout it out. If I'm an A+ student and I'm happy with what happened in Psych 101, how would I answer the question, I am happy with my grades? Would I agree or just, what was that?
Agree.
Yeah, you would agree, right? Now, let's stick with that participant. I am a A+ happy student. I feel upset about my performance. On a scale of disagree to agree, what would they say?
Disagree.
Disagree, right? Good job. So it's switched. And there's important reasons to do this. First off, this avoids a response set, which means that participants just check. And I'm sure you've done this at some point where, like, here, a good example is when you go to the doctor's office and they ask you like to fill out those, I don't know what they're called, but like before you actually meet the doctor. And it's a bunch of stuff of like, have you ever had this disease, this disease, this disease? And for most people, right, it's just no. And so you can probably very briefly look at the question and just go, no. Well, you don't want people to do this in psychological research. And let me go up to a multi-item scale. All right, here we go. All of these are negatively worded, or not negatively worded, but if I was someone who was really angry, I would answer a 10 on this one, a 10 on this one, a 10 on this one, and a 10 on this one. So just imagine if you had a scale that's, 40 items. Like some of the depression stuff is like 40 item scales. And if they're all worded in a way where I'm going to score a 10, after item 15, right, or even after item 5, I'm just going to start doing 10. And we don't want participants to do that. We want them to really read and think about their response. So having some positive and negative worded items, well, let me go back up, will cause participants to actually have to read, because if the first one's positive 10, and let me think of some, I'm trying to come up with a question off the top of my head that would be a negatively worded item. How likely are you to remain calm when you become angry, right? So someone who's really angry would say, oh, a 1. So they have to actually read it. And so you want a mixture of positive and negative items so that way participants aren't just saying 10 all the way through. Where is Okay, so this avoids a response set of, or just straight answers all the way through, but it's also a great way to make sure our participants are paying attention. So if you think about some studies can be very, very long, right? They can be, in my lab, we just got done with a grant, which, a big study, and the surveys that we would ask people could take like 2 hours to fill out. Like they are long, like hundreds of questions. And so, and especially when you're working with adolescents and children, they're more likely to just be like, okay, I'm bored. I'm just going to start randomly clicking answers, right? Because I don't want to do this. I'm sure you've all been there at some point. I'm just going to start putting answers. Well, there's analyses, or not analyses, but you can throw in questions like this to see if participants are answering truthfully. Because let's go back to, or let's stick here. Someone who's an A+ student would say, like, I'm happy with my grades. Okay, they would say 5. And then if they were paying attention, they would say a 1. I strongly disagree. Then I'm not upset about, I'm not upset about my performance. They would say strongly disagree. And so if they didn't say that, and we see that they said 5s all the way down, we can be like, hey, wait a second. This participant did not answer in a way that we would expect, right? We would expect to see some variation, some really high scores and really low scores, because that's just the way the questions are worded. And so potentially we can see that, and we can just throw out that participant because we know they gave fake data. So that's one way to check for consistency in answers. Does that idea make sense of why we want these positive and negative worded questions? Give me a thumbs up in chat or on cam. All right, I'm going to wait until I see a majority of people do it, because I saw probably about 3/4 of the class didn't do it. And I just want to make sure. Does anyone have any questions on that? All right, so that's something that I want you to think about when designing your own questions. And now maybe don't go into designing your questions that way. Like, you can word them all positively, but then just make one of the questions negative, right? You can always reword a question so that's just kind of reverse of how you ask. But I do want to see that and highly suggest that you throw it into your own scale. All right, there's just a couple more. Avoid leading questions. So use neutral wording to encourage participants to be honest. And this isn't probably, actually, it might be relevant for the body image people, but be careful when asking sensitive questions. So only ask for the information you need and nothing more. If you're a participant and you wouldn't want to answer a question, or put yourself in the shoes of your participants. If you wouldn't want to answer one of your questions, or you might feel a little hesitant, don't ask it, right? And then here's another thing you can do. Once again, you won't have any questions that need this for your own study, but if you are asking sensitive questions, maybe use context. So say something along the lines of, like, in your instructions to your paragraph before you have them take the scale, everyone experiences stress in their lives. Which of the following techniques do you use to deal with stress? So that way, these participants aren't just like suddenly bombarded with all these stress questions. You tell participants, hey, it's completely normal to be stressed, and for people to use some coping mechanisms. What kind of coping mechanisms do you use? So provide some context to your participants if you're asking these sensitive questions. And then you should use several questions tapping in the same basic info, but worded differently. And this is actually something not even regarding sensitive questions. This is just something that you should be doing in general, because it's kind of what we talked about, like with the anger, right? We're asking 5, 6, whatever many questions assessing anger, and they're all assessing anger in some way, and they're all worded very similarly. So this is really important in a multi-item scale. All right, so we just have 2 more, or a couple questions. Put it in the direct message in the chat. What's wrong with these questions? So what is the problem that we just talked about? How often do you walk your dog? Is this a leading question, a sensitive question? Is it ambiguous, or is it making assumptions? All right, let's see here. Yeah, I see a majority of D's. That is the correct answer, right? You're assuming your participants have a dog. It's not A, you're not really leading them on. It's not really leading. It's not sensitive, right? You're not talking about a sensitive topic. It's not that ambiguous because like everyone knows what a dog is and how often you walk your dog. Not too bad. Not too confusing. And yeah, it's D. It's making an assumption. Does anyone who said another answer have a question for why it's not what they said? Because I do see several people do have different answers. Whether you want to ask in direct message, if you don't want to speak up, is everyone clear why you're making an assumption that your participants have a dog? Now, you could ask this question, right? But definitely make sure one of your answers is like, NA, I don't have a dog, right? As long as your response option includes that I don't have a dog, it will be fine. But you are making the assumption that they do. All right, and we have one more. Do you agree that campus parking is a problem and that the administration should be working diligently on a solution? So is this negative wording? Is it a sensitive question? Is it a double-barreled item, or is it making assumptions? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of C's here. It's a double-barreled item. You're asking two questions in one. While a majority of people will probably say, well, the answer is yes to both, right? Especially at WVU. What happens if you think that campus parking is a problem? So we would have an option here that says yes and no, right? That's your response options. But what happens if I think campus parking is a problem, but I don't think the administration should be dealing with it? I think it should be a city issue. So how would you answer it then? Would you answer no, or would you answer yes? Because campus parking is a problem, but I don't think administration should be worried. So in a double-barreled item, even though the answer that you think might be, well, the answer is obviously yes, right? So there's only, or no. A participant could have two answers for these two questions. So it's asking two questions here. That's really what a double-barreled item is, right? It's asking two different types of questions, even if you think that the answer is the same for both of them. All right, so that was today's class. Good job.